Hello guys, this is Martin aka Anders, long time no see. In this video I'm going to be taking a walk through both the NA and EU metas, sort of the similarities between the two of them as well as the differences. This is a video I've been looking forward to doing for a long time. I'm always a huge fan of sort of the international metas across the world and taking pieces from one or the other, bringing it to a region where it's not necessarily used as much. And sort of mixing things up. But up until now, EU's sort of been a little bit late to the show. There hasn't been a ton of competitions to go off of. But in the last week or so, we've had a ton of new events crop up. We had the Fnatic Proving Grounds, the mandatory GG Cup, as well as the XCOM Go Cup in Poland, and all of those three added something like 160 total matches to the sample, which was incredibly helpful. And so now we're going to spend some time looking over both the agent picks for both regions as well as compositions. So let's jump right into it. Jumping right into the thick of things, I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. I'm going to list the agents for each region by pick rate on either side of the screen, and then go one by one, sort of juxtaposing the two and letting you know the gap between them. Right off the top, it shouldn't surprise anyone that we have Sage. Sage sees almost 99% play rates in North America, and she is still the most played agent in EU as well. Surprisingly so, she sees a considerably lesser amount of play, still well into the mid 90s, but she comes in 4.2% lower than North American play rates at 94.6% in Europe. Next up, we have our first significant deviation between the two regions with Cypher. In North America, you see him in pretty much every game at this point. Being part of the common core, he's always at the forefront. Surprisingly, however, if you look at his play rates in EU by comparison, he drops down significantly, actually an entire slot on the ladder, being 11% lower than his play rates in NA. I think that there's a very distinct reason for this, and I'll touch on that later on in the video. Next up, we have Brimstone, who finds himself played roughly the same amount across both NA and EU, just 0.2% away from each other at 87.2 in NA and 87.4 in Europe. This is a little bit interesting though, because if you look at the aggregated agent picks in North America, they're very much so concentrated, and in EU, they're very much so spread. So the fact that Brimstone comes in at this high as a percentage in EU reflects sort of a disproportionately high play rate and sort of a more impactful signal than it does in North America. Next up, we have Breach, who really highlights that lack of centralization. He's the fourth most played agent in both regions, but comes in at a whopping 12.5% higher in North America. The fact that he can be that much lower in EU and still be at fourth place on the overall play rates just shows how much more spread their agent picks are. Next up, we have Sova, a fan favorite in North America, but surprisingly less so by a significant margin in Europe. He's played a massive 20.3% more in North America, and we see that very frequently in the Common Core plus Sova being the most played composition on the continent. In the interest of simplicity, I'm not going to jump across and cover the fifth place in EU. I'm just going to go straight down the list of NA and cover them as I go. So next up, we have Phoenix. Phoenix is a little bit of an oddball in that I've always thought he functions more or less as an exclusive inferior to Breach, filling a similar archetypal role, but doing it a little bit worse, at least on most maps. And reflecting that North America only plays him at a 23.7% rate. If you swap over to Europe, though, he sees almost 10% more play, and that's reflected actually in confirmation of my suspicions where they sub him out for Breach a lot. We'll talk about that a little bit more once we hit compositions. Next up, we have Omen at 23% play rate in North America and 26% play rate in EU. This is, again, sort of like Breach, going to be a major highlight of that concentration discrepancy between North America and EU. Despite the fact that he's played more in Europe, he actually places lower on the top 10 just due to the broader distribution of agent picks in EU as opposed to NA. I think that Omen has a lot of room to grow in both regions. I think he fills a really unique archetypal niche, and there's a lot of room for him to be exploited and sort of advanced in his use cases in the meta, and so I'll touch on that a bit more when we get to comps. Now we get to the real knockdown drag-out difference between NA and EU, and that is Raze. Raze is played an astronomical 31% more in EU than she is in NA, which we'll touch on in a bit in compositions because there is a very distinct reason for this, and I think it's something that's very compelling. In fact, if you take this discrepancy and couple it with one other, I think it forms a fundamental and very concise summary of the entire difference in playstyle between NA and EU, at least as indicated by their picks and compositions thus far. Second to last, we have Jett, who's played functionally the same amount in both regions, with a mere 0.1% difference between the both. And last, we have poor old Viper. Interestingly, though, she's played a significant near 5% more in EU than she is in NA. Now that we have an overarching view of what agents are picked differently between each region, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper and see whether or not the win rates of those agents in the different regions substantiates the differences in play rate. In the case of Sova, right off the bat, it is absolutely substantiated. You see him a lot more in North America, and win rates reflect that. In NA, he comes in well above 50%, but in EU, he's lacking significantly. Next up, we have Phoenix, who's in a similar boat. He's played significantly more in EU, and his win rate is actually reflected in that. He sees almost a 2% increase in win rate when played in EU as opposed to NA. Next, we have the first instance of this not making so much sense in Omen. Despite being played 3% more in EU, he actually sees a roughly 3% lower win rate in that region. The other agent that has a massive play gap in Raze also is substantiated. Her 30% increase in play rate when comparing EU to NA is mirrored in an almost 1.5% increase in win rate. Next up, I tossed in Jett, not because she had a huge play rate discrepancy at only 0.1%, but rather that there was a significant win rate discrepancy. She sees 3.5% higher win rates in EU than in NA. Last up, we have Viper, who saw a 5% increase in play rate in EU as opposed to NA. The 5% play rate is pretty significant on its own, but even more so when you take into consideration that her overall play rates are so low that that translates to an almost 150% increase in play rate insular to the agent herself. And the win rates definitely reflect that, with an almost 7.5% increase in win rate in EU as opposed to NA. And so right off the top, we can see that there's a ton of differences between the agent selections in each region. NA sort of concentrating in on the common core plus X, having sort of that key defensive core in the overwhelming majority of their compositions, and the overall percentages reflect that, where EU is showing quite a bit more flexibility where the distribution of their pick rates are far more spread. And now, just to elaborate on that a little bit further, we're going to dive into those compositions. What exactly do those look like? To kick off the compositions and give an overarching summary, I took the 5 most played compositions globally and have their play rates in each region. Right at the top of the ladder, we have a massive meta-defining difference between the two regions in the Common Core plus Sova comp. It comes in just shy of 33% play rate in North America, lagging at a crazily lower, not even 9% in EU. This is humongous. It cannot be understated just how massive of a difference in prioritization this represents. And going into the next composition, which is the Common Core plus Raze, we see sort of the underlying archetypal decision making that goes into that, with the Raze composition being played a similar 8.5% in NA, but in EU being played almost a quarter of the time at 22.3%. The huge difference between this can be boiled down to Sova versus Raze, where Sova is an intel and data gathering oriented agent. He's more defensive skewed, where Raze represents far more of an entry frag secondary type agent and is far more aggressive. This overarchingly tells me that the way that EU chooses to play the game right now is far more offensively oriented than North America. Moving down the list a bit, we have the Common Core plus Omen. You may remember that Omen was played more in EU than in NA. In spite of that, this composition shows up more in NA than in EU, which would imply that EU, when they do play Omen, regularly and more consistently play him outside of Common Core compositions. Next up, we have a composition that I've talked about a fair bit in my most recent videos, in the Common Core plus Phoenix. I'm not a massive fan of it myself. I feel like it unnecessarily doubles down on entry fraggers and flashes, with both Breach and Phoenix filling a very similar role. I feel like one of their slots is better allocated to an agent that brings a more diversified set of utility to the table. But even so, this comp shows up as the 4th most played globally at 6% in NA and 2.9% in EU. It's interesting that right after I discuss EU's more aggressive inclinations, this composition doesn't show as highly in their picks, despite the fact that it does have that very, very aggressive skew. Then again, I'll be touching on a composition in just a few moments that explains this away a bit. Rounding out the top 5, we have a comp that touches on the concept that I've mentioned a few times now, where I think Breach and Phoenix fill a very similar role. It is functionally the Common Core plus Sova, but instead swaps the Breach out for Phoenix. Just to be a little bit cheeky, and harkening back to my World of Warcraft roots, I've dubbed this variation on the Common Core the Molten Core, hinting at Phoenix's flames and the Common Core as the basis. Hopefully some of you guys find that as hilarious as I do, because boomer jokes. Now that I've touched on the top 5 comps globally and how they're represented in NA and EU, I wanted to touch on what the top 5 comps are in each region respectively and how they compare. First up, we have the Common Core plus Sova, that comes in as the #1 most played composition in NA, but the 2nd most played in EU. Next up, we have the Common Core plus Raze, that is an exact mirror, where it is the most played in EU, but the 2nd most played in NA. Now things start to get a little bit messier, where we have the Common Core plus Omen as the 3rd most played composition in North America, but the 4th most played composition in EU. Next up, we have a comp that I said was coming. It is the Molten Core plus Raze, or Brimstone, Cypher, Phoenix, Sage, and Raze. This, if you compare it to the composition that NA likes quite a bit, which is Breach, Brimstone, Cypher, Sage, and Phoenix, the Common Core plus Phoenix, it forgoes the doubling down on flashes and instead swaps out the Breach for Raze, instead favoring her ability to aggressively clear corners. And I think that this is another one of those compositions that very strongly highlights EU's more aggressive leanings. Sliding back over to NA, we have that exact comp coming in at number 4, the Common Core plus Phoenix. At number 5 on both the lists is where we completely do away with any sort of similarities. On NA's side, we have the Molten Core plus Sova, and on the EU side, we have the Molten Core plus Jet, of all things. The Molten Core plus Jet is a super interesting composition. It actually saw a lot of play in the 2 most recent high-profile EU events in the Mandatory Cup as well as the XCOM A-Go Cup. In the Mandatory Cup, it was played repeatedly by Team Nordic, a roster made of Fortnite names like Noisy, as well as CSGO players such as Patatek. And if you look over at the XCOM A-Go Cup, it was played by both Fortensborz and Balanced, the 2 teams that would go on to take 1st and 2nd in the entire tournament. I don't know what kind of secret sauce EU has for playing Jet, but NA needs to get their hands on some. A little bit similar to what I did with Agents, I wanted to now take a look at what sort of win rate discrepancies we can see here, but in the interest of keeping this video under 1 billion hours long, I'm going to just touch on the top compositions from each region. In NA, you have the Common Core plus Sova, and in EU, you have the Common Core plus Raze, those 2 top-tier compositions that really highlight the defensive versus offensive nature of each region respectively. And so a question that I'm sure everyone who's a fan of NA versus EU rivalry is wondering is, who wins more? And the answer is that if you look at just their best compositions, EU wins more with their favored composition than NA wins with their favored composition. The Common Core plus Sova being a 52% win rate in NA, and the Common Core plus Raze being a 54% win rate in EU. And that brings this one to a close. I've always been a fan of international metas, being the number cruncher that I am, and coming from a background in both League of Legends and World of Warcraft. International metas are always a huge part of the games that I play, so being able to finally take a look at it for Valorant was super fun. As usual, if you guys like this or you have any recommendations for my content going forward, I read every single comment that I get right now. I'm still at the size where I can look at all of your guys' feedback, and I'll definitely do so. And if you guys are enjoying what I'm doing, you can catch more of my commentary and just my general thoughts on my Twitter and Instagram at AndersTV, and you can also come check me out when I'm streaming. It's often with my collegiate players at AndersTV on Twitch as well. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.